Big Shaq learns his brother is struggling to pay rent. A truth hidden in silence, buried in pride. No cameras roll, no press follows. But something shifts. Behind the scenes, Big Shaq moves with quiet force, building what the world can't see. And when the dust settles, what Big Shaq does doesn't just help his brother, it sparks a silent revolution that inspires millions. Before we deep dive into this interesting story, subscribe to our channel, and tell us where are you watching from. Share in the comments below. The Florida sun had just begun to streak gold across the water when Shaquille O'Neal stepped out onto the back patio of his lakeside estate. The air was thick with warmth, the kind that wrapped itself around your shoulders like a blanket. Not oppressive but intimate. It was a Sunday, and Sundays in the O'Neal household meant pancakes with blueberries, gospel music humming low from the kitchen speakers, and the quiet thrum of normalcy. Something Shaq, despite all his wealth and fame, guarded like treasure. He stretched barefoot against the cool tile, staring out at the shimmering lake. It wasn't the view that grounded him, it was the sounds inside. His daughter Mara giggling as she raced their dog through the hallway. His wife Shani humming in rhythm, with the sizzling skillet, and the steady clink of cutlery that always meant his mother Lucille was setting the table. Just the way she liked it, perfectly symmetrical, always with linen napkins. Shaq was no stranger to attention. No rookie to praise. His presence had once dominated arenas. His name stitched across jerseys. His face filling screens coast to coast. But here in his house, he was just daddy, just Shaq. Just the boy Lucille raised with strict hands and a full heart. He cherished the quiet, the daily rituals, the anonymity of love within family. As he stepped into the kitchen, the rich smell of butter and syrup wrapped around him. Shani looked up from the stove and smiled. That half smile that said, "You better not sneak one before the plate's ready." He grinned back and swiped a single blueberry pancake when she turned her head. Lucille, seated at the far end of the table, caught him in the act and shook her head, pretending to scold him with narrowed eyes, though her lips twitched with amusement. They sat together, 4 plates, 1 table, a sea of warmth, but there was a flicker of something else in the air too. Subtle, strange. Shaq noticed it when Lucille barely touched her pancakes. When she laughed too quickly at Mira's joke. When she glanced at her phone not once but twice. A thing she never did at the breakfast table. It wasn't overt. It was quiet, like the hum of something approaching that hadn't yet crested the hill. Shaq leaned back in his chair, watching her. The room was bright, loud with love, yet her eyes were heavy, distant, as if anchored by something she hadn't told them yet. She caught him staring and gave him a small, practiced smile. Not fake, but protective, the kind of smile mothers used when they wanted to hold the burden a little longer. "Everything good, Mama?" he asked casually, not letting the tension touch his voice. Lucille took a moment before answering. "Of course, baby. Just got a lot on my mind. Church business." He nodded, but didn't buy it. Lucille was transparent in her faith and her feelings. Church business never left her eyes that hollow. The rest of the morning unfolded without event. Laughter returning like a tide. Mara pulling Lucille into a game of cards, while Shani retreated to the garden with her laptop. Shaq moved around the house, but his mind remained rooted in that strange, weighted smile. He knew his mother well enough to recognize when she was holding something back. And this wasn't just church drama or community gossip. In his office, away from the gentle chaos of family, he pulled out his phone and tapped into his contacts. Not the usual ones, not agents or publicists or event managers, but old friends, people from Newark, from back home, folks he hadn't called in a while. As his fingers hovered, he paused. Something told him not to make that call yet. Instead, he wandered into the room where Lucille kept her prayer journals and old photographs. It wasn't snooping, it was instinct. She often asked him to fetch her notes or find a specific passage, but what caught his eye this time wasn't scripture or childhood photos. It was a folded envelope, unsealed, addressed in Lucille's handwriting. No name on the front, just initials. L. He didn't open it. He didn't need to. Those initials could only belong to one person. Lennox O'Neal, his half-brother. The one no one spoke about at breakfast. Not anymore. A gust of memory struck him. Lennox laughing beside him. At a high school game. Lennox covering for him when he missed curfew. Lennox disappearing when the NBA lights got too bright. Their bond had frayed, unraveled by time, pride and silence. but the ache it left never quite disappeared. He took the envelope to the living room, handed it to Lucille gently. She looked up from her cards, and her smile vanished. "I didn't mean to find it," Shaq said, "but I think you wanted me to." Lucille held the letter for a long while, then nodded slowly. She dismissed Mara with a soft pat, waited until the girl skipped upstairs, and then motioned for Shaq to sit beside her. "I've been meaning to talk to you," she said quietly, fingers tracing the corner of the envelope. "He's not doing well." Shaq said nothing. Lucille sighed, voice breaking. "He's back in Newark. Was evicted last month. He's been trying, Shaquille. He's trying hard. But every door shuts in his face. They see a black man with a record, and that's all they see. Doesn't matter what his intentions are." Shaq looked out the window. The lake glistened. His home stood tall and secure. His brother lived under a different sky, one of steel and shadows. "You didn't tell me," he said finally. "I knew you'd want to fix it," she replied, her voice trembling. "And I wasn't sure he'd let you. The silence that followed wasn't heavy. It was sharp. It cut through years of avoidance, carving a space for something rawer than guilt. Responsibility. Shaq stood and nodded slowly. He didn't need the rest of the letter. The truth was already in the air. His mother's eyes had told him everything. His brother's silence had said the rest. And though no one knew it yet, the world Shaq had built, one of comfort, legacy, and giving, was about to be tested in ways he never imagined. Because the storm, quiet as it was, had finally reached his doorstep. The next morning carried a stillness that felt manufactured, like the world had paused just long enough for someone to whisper something important and heavy. The sun cast long shadows across the tiled floor of Shaq's study as he sat behind his mahogany desk, fingers steepled, eyes scanning nothing in particular. Lucille's voice still lingered in his head. "Have you talked to your brother lately?" The question had been so simple, yet it carried the weight of years of choices not made, of calls never returned. He hadn't spoken to Lennox in nearly 4 years. Their last interaction had been brief, bitter and unfinished. It was after a family gathering, one of those half-formal events meant to maintain appearances. Lennox had shown up late, wearing a wrinkled blazer, and an expression that didn't match the occasion. The two brothers had spoken in the hallway, away from the laughter. Shaq had offered help, financial help, a connection maybe, and Lennox had bristled, fire in his eyes. "I'm not some charity case you get to fix, Shaquille." The words had landed like glass shattering between them. Pride had spoken, louder than reason. Shaq had walked away, convincing himself that if Lennox wanted distance, he'd give it to him. Now sitting in the quiet of his home, he questioned whether distance had turned into neglect. He opened a locked drawer in his desk and pulled out an old composition notebook, the kind with frayed edges and ruled paper. Inside were a few notes Lennox had scribbled years ago. Ideas for a community space in Newark, a barbershop that doubled as a mentorship hub, maybe a small cafe in the back where ex-cons could work shifts. Shaq had once promised to fund it, but the conversation had derailed when Lennox rejected the idea of handouts. He hadn't known then how deep Lennox's distrust ran, how shaped he was by a system that told men like him they were only valuable if they struggled independently. Shaq stared at the notes, feeling the edges of guilt press into his chest. He stood, grabbed his keys, and left the house without a word. He didn't want to alert Lucille or Shawnee. This wasn't about fanfare. It wasn't a public gesture. It was personal. It was overdue. Instead of taking his usual Escalade, he picked the Jeep from the side garage. Less attention, less luxury. He threw on a plain hoodie, shades, and a cap. He didn't want to be Big Shaq today. He needed to be someone else. Someone who could walk into the past without the world watching. He drove through back routes, crossing from sunny suburbia into the winding guts of the city. Every turn toward Newark felt like peeling back layers of himself he hadn't looked at in years. The storefronts grew older, paint more faded, and the faces on the sidewalk told stories he could still understand, stories he'd grown out of, but never really left behind. The first place he stopped was Hector's barbershop. Hector had been around since they were kids. He used to cut both Lennox and Shaq's hair, back when they still shared a bedroom, and wore matching knockoff Jordans. Hector had a sharp memory, and a sharper tongue. When Shaq walked in, the bell over the door rang like a memory. Hector looked up from his chair, paused, and then narrowed his eyes. "Ain't seen your giant self in a minute." Shaq smiled. "Didn't come for a cut. I figured." "Sit down." They talked without ceremony, without pleasantries. Shaq asked about Lennox. Hector sighed, leaned back, and ran a hand over his scalp. He was doing good for a while, Hector said. Had a little setup down on Bergen. Rented space behind that rundown record shop. Called it Ellis Cuts. Clever, right? Shaq nodded, not trusting his voice. But it didn't last. Hector continued. Landlord jacked up the rent. Lennox missed 2 months and got tossed. He's couch surfing. Maybe worse. Been keeping low. Real low. Shaq felt something twist inside him. Not just sadness, but anger at a system he thought he understood, but had never really battled himself. He had the tools, the money, the platform, and Lennox had none of it. Just as before, Shaq had risen and Lennox had been left behind, not because he was lazy, but because he was black, proud, and poor. The triple combination society didn't give grace to. Where is he now? Shaq asked. Hector hesitated. Maybe Jersey City. I heard from a kid who saw him sleeping in that old auto garage off Grand Street. Shaq nodded. Thanks. Hector's voice followed him as he reached the door. He don't want pity, Shaq. Just remember that. Shaq drove toward Grand Street, the landscape shifting into warehouses and graffiti-tagged fences. He parked a block away and walked. It was quieter here, the air thicker, more uncertain. As he approached the garage, he saw it, a structure that once had windows, now boarded up, the door slightly ajar. He stood outside, uncertain. Going in felt invasive, but turning away felt worse. A voice inside his head, his mother's, reminded him that family doesn't knock when blood calls. So he stepped in. It was dark, but not empty. A mattress lay in the corner, covered with a blanket that had seen better days. A small camp stove rested nearby. There were boxes, tools, a small stack of books, and a pair of battered sneakers near the wall. But Lennox wasn't there. Shaq looked around, not as a superstar, not even as a brother, but as a man trying to understand how someone he loved had ended up here. He didn't touch anything, just stood in silence, letting the reality soak in. A rustle behind him made him turn. Someone stepped into the doorway. Lennox. Older, leaner, more weathered than before. His eyes, however, were the same. Sharp, defiant, tired. They stared at each other for a long moment. You stalking me now? Lennox asked, voice flat. Shaq didn't answer immediately. I came to see you. Lennox laughed, dry and bitter. Took you long enough? I didn't know, Shaq admitted. You didn't ask. The air between them pulsed with unfinished history. The words that might have followed, apologies, accusations, explanations, hovered but never landed. Instead, Lennox walked past him, grabbed a small duffel from the floor, and slung it over his shoulder. Don't come here with charity, he muttered. You got your world, I got mine. He walked out before Shaq could speak again. Shaq remained where he was, frozen. This wasn't going to be simple. But then again, nothing real ever was. Shaquille O'Neal moved through Newark's neighborhoods in an unadorned Jeep, wearing a gray hoodie, pulled low over his brow, sunglasses hiding the star behind a mask of anonymity. The air was heavy, charged with stories and scents he once knew too well. Gravel dust, distant exhaust, the faint aroma of coffee and fried donuts. He wasn't here to be recognized. He was here to listen. He parked a block away from the corner shop near Bergen Street and walked unhurriedly. Many heads turned as he passed, but most returned to their routines. Here, celebrities were fleeting, and survival was constant. A group of young men loitering at the bus stop paused when he passed. One murmured something, maybe a name, but the others shrugged. Nobody confronted him. Newark had seen larger figures than him come and go, search and leave. His first stop was a classic neighborhood barbershop, Eddie's Clipper Corner. The bell above the door jingled sharply as he entered. Drawing a few curious glances, he picked a seat and pretended to fix his cap, feeling the cool hum of the shop's old fan overhead. He watched Eddie, a stocky man in his 50s, carefully trimming a regular customer's neckline. Shaq waited until the haircut finished, then leaned forward and tapped Eddie's shoulder gently. Eddie? The barber looked up, his hand still poised in midair. Recognition flickered in his eyes. Shaq? He whispered. He straightened from behind the chair, wiping his hands on a towel. What brings the king of the court back here in camo? Shaq forced a laugh. Just curious. Eddie nodded, cautiously warm. Lots changed since you left. He waved toward the chair. Shaq sat, And Eddie resumed. But people still talk about your brother too. Shaq swallowed. Heard anything? Eddie paused. The Clippers still. Word is, he lost another spot. Got evicted again, right before winter. Put everything he had into that barbershop in the old factory. But the landlord doubled the rent. Lennox couldn't catch up. He shook his head. Don't know where he is now. Probably couch surfing. Shaq exhaled slowly. The Clippers buzzed again. He wanted more dates, names, last sightings. Eddie's eyes flicked to the next customer. He was pissed, man. Said the system was rigged. Maybe he's in Jersey. His old friend Carlos was helping him check on some garage spot. Shaq nodded, but didn't say more. On the way out, Eddie's hand dropped on his shoulder. Quiet. He's not begging, Shaq. He's surviving. Shaq let the words sink in, thanked Eddie, and left into the building's hallway where the contrast hit him like a wave. His polished estate versus Lennox's rough edges. He moved on, steps measured. His next stop was the corner liquor store, Rosa's Place. A fixture since childhood. The bell clanged again as he stepped inside, the familiar ding releasing years of memory. Shaq headed to the back, where Rosa, petite and fierce, was stacking shelves. Her face still had that flash of surprise when she registered him. Shaq? She asked, voice low enough to keep half the store from listening. Hey, Rosa. Don't want nothing. Just asking. Her tone shifted, careful. Thought you might have heard something about your brother. Shaq nodded. Anything. She leaned in and whispered. Saw him a few weeks ago. He came by, asked if he could sleep in the storage room, said he'd help with restocking, clean floors, anything, but I couldn't. Didn't have the space, so I gave him a few dollars. Shaq closed his eyes. That flicker of memory, Lennox's grin, hope until reality crushed it. Did he say where he was going? Rosa paused, frown creasing her brow. Last he said, he was looking into a garage on Grand Street, but I don't know if he got it. The landlord came in a few days later. Metal clamps, lock changed. Shaq nodded again, bought a bottle of water, paid in cash. Rosa watched him go, her gaze softer now. Hour by hour, piece by piece, the city offered him a fractal of Lennox's struggle. Evictions, half-finished dreams, pride bruised by closed doors and uncaring landlords. Invisible battles waged in the light of day. No drama, no fanfare. He left the store and walked back toward the Jeep, feeling the weight of each step. On his way, he passed a group of kids playing basketball on a rundown court. He paused, hands in his pockets, watching them navigate broken concrete and makeshift rims. They didn't notice him at first, but when one glanced up, a hush fell over them. They recognized his stride. One younger kid mouthed Shaq. He simply nodded, then turned away, keeping his face concealed. If they saw him, it didn't matter. They needed to keep playing. He thought of Lennox then. The difference between the month Lennox raised rent and the month the court waived it. Between turning away and stepping in. He climbed into the Jeep and drove east, toward the river's outskirts and Grand Street. The neighborhood shifted to warehouses, train tracks, shuttered businesses, signs that read no trespassing, and property under surveillance crawled past his windows. He parked again, this time at a slight distance, and walked down a dirt path parallel to the road. He saw it before he reached it. A rusting garage door, the bottom edge dented, the top plastered with faded graffiti. He peered in through the gap. Not many boxes, no mattress, just emptiness and dust collecting in corners. He stepped in, feet crunching glass shards and old screws. The place smelled of metal and mold. A half-burned candle on the ground had frozen mid-flame in its wax pool. On one wall someone had scrawled in charcoal, "Hustle don't stop, but rent does." That line cut deep. Shaq traced it with his finger. His pulse quickened. He had found Lennox's ground, but not Lennox himself. Not yet. He turned, stepping back out, and held himself in the cold light of the day. The city hummed around him. Trains, trucks, distant sirens. He closed his eyes and breathed. He had a mission now, sharper and clearer. Find Lennox, not just chase rumors, but bring him home. But he couldn't rush. The lesson so far had been about listening, not telling. He got in the Jeep, thumbed off the ignition, and rolled down the window. For a moment, he let the city rush in. The unfinished streets, the stories in their half-built courtyards, the injustice written into their seams. Then he drove north. Plan forming in his mind, eyes focused beyond the immediate. This was no PR move, no headline. This was personal. And the city, the streets, the people, would reveal everything. They always did. The garage on Grand Street stood quiet under a gray, low-hanging sky, the sort that made every sound echo louder than it should. Shaq returned the following morning, dressed the same as before, moving like a shadow in a city that remembered him, but chose for now to look away. He parked behind a long-abandoned furniture store, stepping lightly over broken glass and cracked pavement, his 6'7" frame hunched to avoid attention. He could hear something soft shuffling, maybe music coming from behind the rusted door. This time, the place wasn't empty. Inside, the converted garage looked barely livable. A thin mattress was shoved into a corner, blanketed with layers that couldn't possibly keep out the cold. There was a hot plate, a fold-out chair, and a battered radio that struggled to hold on to a signal. A half-used bar of soap rested beside a paint can filled with water. Shaq scanned the room with quiet disbelief. For all his wealth, all the lives he'd changed from a distance, he hadn't changed this, hadn't changed what his own blood had come to accept as normal. And there, hunched over the radio, twisting a wire with stubborn focus, was Lennox. The moment he sensed a presence behind him, Lennox froze. He didn't turn right away, just said flatly, "Thought I told you not to come back." Shaq stood still. "You didn't say it, you just walked out." Lennox turned, eyes sharp and tired. "That's how you read it?" "I came to talk." Lennox dropped the wire, stood and walked across the room, not toward Shaq, but toward the opposite wall. He reached for a jacket, pulled it on with deliberate slowness. "I don't need charity, Shaquille. That's not what this is." "Then what is it?" Lennox snapped, spinning around. "You think I'm some mission now? Another check to write so you can sleep better at night?" Shaq didn't flinch. He stepped forward, not to close the distance in dominance but to soften it. "I didn't know you were living like this." "And that's the problem," Lennox shot back. "You didn't know? You stopped knowing a long time ago." The silence that followed was charged, not with anger, but with history. Years of quiet, years of choices made without each other. Shaq looked around again, at the makeshift home, the fading graffiti on the far wall, the creaking door held in place with wire. "You could have called me," Shaq said quietly. "I did once," Lennox replied, voice low and jagged. "You were at a red carpet, some charity gala, left a message, never heard back." Shaq closed his eyes, tried to remember. It could have been any year. So many things blurred together now. The appearances, the causes, the dinners with executives who spoke about equity, but never crossed town. "I didn't ignore you," he said. "You didn't have to." Silence does the same thing. Lennox walked past him, opened the garage door halfway to let in more light. The morning sun cast long shadows across the concrete floor. "You remember when we used to sleep in Grandma's basement?" he said suddenly. "When the heater broke and we piled socks over our hands." Shaq nodded. "You remember what you said back then? You said, 'When I make it, I'll buy you a house bigger than this whole block.' You remember that?" "Yeah," Shaq whispered. "I didn't need the house, man," Lennox said, finally meeting his eyes. "I needed you to remember." Shaq took a deep breath, stepped into the sunlit patch of floor between them. "I never forgot." "You forgot what mattered." There it was, the wound neither had spoken about. It wasn't money. It wasn't opportunity. It was absence. Lennox had built his life in the cracks left behind, while Shaq had built towers above the clouds. And though neither had ever raised a fist, the space between them had become a battleground. "Why didn't you ask me for help?" Shaq asked. "Because help that has to be asked for is already a burden," Lennox replied. "Because the second you give me a hand, the world calls me a dependent. Because you're Big Shaq and I'm just some brother who couldn't hack it." That's not true. It is to them. The room went quiet again. Outside, a delivery truck rumbled past, its brakes hissing like a punctuation mark. Shaq looked around one more time, seeing not just what the space was, but what it had been to Lennox. A last stand, a hollowed-out dream, a place where hope could still fit, barely. "I'm not here to save you," he said finally. "I came because I should have been here all along." Lennox didn't respond. He leaned against the doorframe, hands buried in his coat pockets, the breeze lifting the edges of his jacket. His face had aged, but it hadn't hardened. Beneath the lines was still the boy Shaq had grown up with, the one who'd fought his corner, covered his tracks, laughed the loudest at his jokes. "I tried to build something," Lennox said, quieter now. The barbershop wasn't about money. It was about proving I could take care of something. Give people like us a space. I know, Shaq said. I read your old notes. Lennox blinked. Mom kept them? Shaq nodded. She's been worried. So have I. I just took too long. You got your life. I don't blame you. I do, Shaq said. I let too much time pass. I thought maybe you'd call. Maybe you'd show up at Thanksgiving, like you used to. But I should have come to you. Lennox didn't say anything. He just stared out at the road, then turned back slower this time. You got all this power, Shaq. All this reach. But there are people out here, just like me, who don't want a handout. We want a shot. A fair one. Shaq nodded. Then let me help make that happen. Not with a check. No, Shaq said. With something real. Something that lasts. Lennox studied him for a long moment. Why now? Shaq looked around, letting the weight of the place settle on his shoulders. Because I finally looked past the headlines. And I saw you. Lennox didn't smile, but he didn't turn away either. That was enough. Shaq took a few steps back toward the exit. I'm staying in town. When you're ready to talk again, I'll be here. He turned and walked out, the rusted door groaning as it swung behind him. Lennox stood alone in the doorway, wind tugging at the edges of his coat. He didn't follow, but he didn't close the door either. And that was how it started. Not with forgiveness. Not with promises. But with the door left half open. Shaquille O'Neal sat alone in his home office. That evening, the overhead light casting a quiet glow across stacks of papers and framed accolades. Outside, the Florida night whispered through the trees. But inside, the silence was different now. Waited. He had returned home physically, but some part of him was still standing in that cold garage, in the worn-out presence of a brother who had been left to weather storms alone. He stared at the unopened box on the floor. A bin Lucille had handed him weeks ago, saying it was full of old mementos he might want to digitize. He hadn't bothered until now. Tonight, it felt like a responsibility. Shaq opened the lid and sifted through old clippings, faded photos, elementary school drawings. Tucked between a third-grade report card and an old set of birthday cards was a yellowed envelope, partially torn open at the top. The handwriting struck him immediately. Bold, blocky, urgent. It was Lennox's. There was no stamp, no return address, just the date in the top right corner. March. Shaq unfolded the letter slowly, his large hands dwarfing the paper. The ink had faded slightly but was still legible. As he read, his chest tightened. Shaq, I don't know if this'll ever reach you. Maybe Mom gives it to you. Maybe she doesn't. Maybe you find it buried in her Bible years from now. I tried, man. I really tried. That shop on Bergen Els Cuts. I poured everything into it. Saved every damn dollar. Got help from a couple of friends who still believed in second chances. We fixed it up ourselves. Bought secondhand chairs, mirrors, clipper. I made a schedule, printed flyers, handed them out on corners like it was nothing. You know what happened next? Nothing. Banks said no to the loan. Too much risk, they said. My record, they said. Even though it's been 10 years clean, even though I've done my time, even though I've had no trouble since. One slip when I was a kid, and now I'm cemented into a category they don't want to fund. Landlord hiked the rent when he saw me trying to fix the place. Told me it was a hot property. Now that a white developer bought the lot next door, I couldn't pay. He knew I couldn't. I tried talking to investors. Small business programs. They all smiled until they heard the neighborhood. Then they vanished. So I lost it. The shop. The dream. Everything. Again. But the worst part, Shaq. It wasn't the money. It was the looks. The way people looked at me. Like I was still that punk kid. Like I'd never be more than a shadow of you. I'm not writing for sympathy. You've got your world. I've got mine. But I just needed to put this somewhere. To tell someone I tried. Maybe I just wanted you to be proud. Lennox. By the time Shaq reached the bottom of the page, his eyes were glassed over. The room, so filled with material symbols of achievement, now felt hollow. He leaned back in his chair, the letter trembling in his hand. Lennox had written this 2 years ago, while Shaq was on a press tour for a luxury sneaker line, giving keynote speeches about legacy and perseverance. And while he stood on stages, applauded for his wisdom, Lennox was being denied the right to rebuild his life over a mistake made decades ago. This wasn't just about family anymore. It was about something deeper. Shaq folded the letter gently and set it on the desk, as if it were something sacred. His thoughts raced, not with shame, but with clarity. All these years, he'd believed that success gave him perspective, but success had only made it easier to believe the system worked, as long as you knew how to play it. Lennox had been playing a different game, one where the rules shifted with every step he took, where the banks, landlords and lenders didn't care about who he was, only about who he had once been. Shaq thought his name, his influence could solve everything, but Lennox didn't need a savior. He needed a world that didn't punish redemption. A deeper fire lit inside Shaq. For years he'd donated to causes quietly, generously, but he realized now that no amount of check writing reached this level. This was personal. This was structural. This was real. He picked up his phone, not to make a call, but to open his notes app. He began typing, outlining ideas, real estate options, mentorship circles, legal counsel for ex-cons, not just for Lennox, but for everyone like him. But even as he built out his plan, the letter remained in front of him, unmoving. A symbol not just of what had been lost, but of what still could be recovered. And somewhere deep inside he knew this wasn't about reuniting with a brother. It was about rebuilding a bridge, one brick at a time between two worlds that had stopped speaking. Shaquille O'Neal was done waiting for the world to catch up. He had spent the last 2 weeks steeped in reflection, the weight of Lennox's letter anchoring him in a deeper sense of purpose. Something had shifted, not in anger, not in guilt, but in clarity. There would be no interviews, no press conferences, no flashy headlines. What he was about to do wasn't for the spotlight. It was for something harder to earn and harder to fake: redemption. He moved with precision, quietly. Every decision calculated, every move made with the discretion of a man who understood that power worked best when it wasn't noticed. He changed his phone number, set up a shell LLC, under the name Trinity Holdings. The address linked to a private mailbox in a town no one would associate with him. The goal wasn't to hide from scrutiny. It was to make sure the project grew on its own merit, not because of the name tied to a basketball legacy. The first step was real estate. Through a private broker, recommended discreetly by a friend who owed him a favor, Shaq identified a crumbling 2-story brick structure, just 3 blocks from where Lennox had been squatting. Once a corner hardware store, the building had since become a graffiti canvas, its windows blown out, roof half collapsed. To most it was unsalvageable, but to Shaq it was the blueprint of something bigger. He visited the site under the guise of an investor named Jerome Walker, wearing thick-rimmed glasses and a subtle prosthetic around his jawline that distorted his facial profile just enough. The contractor he hired to inspect the building, Miss Keating, a weathered man who had rebuilt parts of Trenton after Hurricane Sandy, didn't recognize him. That's how Shaq wanted it. "What are you planning to do with this dump?" Keating had asked, glancing up at the busted signage above the front door. Shaq replied evenly, "Turn it into something people actually need." He didn't say more. He didn't need to. Next came the permits, zoning, code inspections. He moved through bureaucratic red tape like a ghost, assisted by a retired city planner from Newark, who helped navigate the chaos for a flat fee and no questions asked. Within 3 weeks, the building was cleared for reconstruction. No news story, no Instagram posts, just paper, ink, and resolve. But this was more than a building project. Shaq wasn't just putting up walls. He was designing an engine. The idea came together late one night in his home office. Using Lennox's old barbershop blueprints as a starting point, he mapped out a concept: a barbershop on the surface, a community investment beneath it, a second floor with legal aid offices, a back room for financial literacy workshops, a rotating food pantry, built into the old stockroom. It would look like a revival of an old neighborhood staple. But in truth it would be a system, a soft revolution dressed in brick and wood paneling. And Lennox? He would never know Shaq was behind it. At least, not yet. Shaq worked silently but with fire. He started hiring through third-party referrals, reformed ex-cons who had barber licenses, young construction apprentices from vocational schools, women who had been shut out of local business councils. He paid above union rate, but never spoke directly to them. The payments came through the shell company, anonymous but generous. The mission grew faster than he anticipated. Then came the art. He commissioned a local muralist, known for transforming alleyways into storytelling murals, to paint the inside of the new barbershop. But the artist was given no reference photos. Instead, Shaq provided only a phrase: "Where pride meets purpose." The artist returned with sketches that turned the shop into a visual memory box, Blues, deep reds, golden undertones. One section depicted a young black boy cutting another boy's hair in a makeshift setup. In the corner was a shadowed outline of a father figure, watching, guiding, present, but never imposing. Shaq approved it instantly. He watched the construction evolve from a distance, driving in late at night, parking across the street, observing the scaffolding and workers by moonlight. He took no photos, said no words, just watched. He saw Lennox once, walking past the site, head low, hands in his coat pockets. Lennox didn't stop, didn't even glance up. The building was just another project in a city that had offered him nothing but closed doors. That was about to change. Weeks passed, and the transformation accelerated. Word on the street began to spread. Locals whispered about second sons, the name painted in elegant script across the front window. They thought it was a new barbershop chain moving in. Others thought it was a re-entry program, disguised as a business. No one could pin down who owned it. That anonymity was the key. The day the chairs were delivered, deep brown leather, vintage cast iron bases, Shaq stood inside for the first time in daylight. The smell of fresh paint, sawdust and possibility lingered. The sun poured in through new panes of glass, striking the mural in a way that made it seem alive. Keating, the contractor, looked around approvingly. Didn't think we'd pull it off. Shaq smiled slightly beneath his disguise. Sometimes the things you don't see coming hit the hardest. Keating chuckled. Still don't know why you kept your name off all this. You could have had the mayor out here shaking hands. That's not what this is, Shaq said, already turning away. That night he sent one final message through a contact at a local nonprofit who had once worked with Lennox. The message was simple. A shop's opening on East Hudson. Could use someone who knows the craft. Ask for the keys. No signature. No hint. Just an open door. As he drove away, the building faded in his rearview mirror, but the future it contained burned vividly in his mind. This was no longer about redemption for a single man. It was a structure born from silence, built in secrecy, powered by belief. An uprising without banners. A revolution without noise, but one that would change everything. The building stood under streetlight shadows, polished and proud. Just days from opening, second sons gleamed across the front in script, and the hand-painted mural inside, part memory, part prophecy, waited for its first witness. Everything Shaq had built in silence was ready to speak on its own terms. But the city wasn't done testing him. That Thursday night, Shaq sat in his Jeep, across the street, hood drawn low, watching. He came most nights to check the progress, not out of paranoia but devotion. Each night he watched his quiet rebellion take shape. The barbershop was more than a structure. It was a promise carved out of old pain and quiet belief. It was just past midnight when they came. Two figures, hooded, fast movements, nervous but determined. One held a can of spray paint. The other kept lookout. Shaq didn't move. He could have stepped out, confronted them. But he didn't. Something in his chest told him to stay still. He watched as the first line of paint hissed onto the glass. 3 words. A racial slur, bold and ugly, in black letters across the mural-facing window. The figures fled before the sound had even settled. Tires squealed in the distance. Silence returned, but it was no longer peaceful. Shaq sat there, unmoving, fury running cold and precise through his veins. The air inside the Jeep thickened with the heat of restraint. He stared at the words, not in fear, not in defeat, but in recognition. He'd seen them before, scrawled across locker room stalls, muttered beneath breath at press junkets, embedded in housing deeds, bank rejections, loan denials. But this time, they'd sprayed it across hope, across effort, across something he hadn't done for himself, but for those who had no backup plan, no spotlight to outshine cruelty. He stepped out of the car, crossed the street, and stood in front of the window, alone. The slur stared back at him, as if daring him to undo what had been done. He didn't call the police, didn't take pictures, didn't reach for his phone. He just stared. Then, without a word, he turned, unlocked the door to the shop, and went inside. He returned minutes later with supplies. Old paint cans, brushes, and a roller he kept for touch-ups. He opened the backroom sink, filled a bucket, and stepped into the cool night. The city was asleep, but Shaq was awake with purpose. By 2 a.m., the words were gone. In their place he painted a new message, subtle but firm. In bold navy, beneath the shop name he wrote, "We're still here." No exclamation point, no hashtags, just defiance, in script. He left before sunrise. By mid-morning, word had spread. A local jogger posted a photo of the vandalized window before the repaint. It hit social media like gasoline finding flame. Racist vandalism at Newark shop days before opening became the headline. But no one could find the owner. No security footage showed who repainted it. The shop's LLC linked to a dummy address. The workers had no clue who paid them. The artist thought the place was city-sponsored.
No one said Shaquille O'Neal's name.
And he intended to keep it that way. He spent that morning in his home office, watching the story unfold. Cable news picked it up by noon. Local leaders condemned the act. Civil rights groups began organizing support. Protest signs appeared on the sidewalk in front of the shop. Not here. Our city, our future. Cut hate, not hair. But through it all, the mystery of who cleaned the wall became the loudest question. Shaq didn't answer it. He let the silence speak. That night, as reporters gathered outside the storefront, Shaq drove past in his Jeep, unseen. He parked 2 blocks down and walked to the corner, keeping to shadows. He watched a girl, no more than 10, stand with her father, staring at the mural through the glass. The father explained something. The girl nodded. She smiled. They left. That moment was enough. He didn't need a ribbon cutting. Didn't want applause. All he needed was that image. A child seeing resistance turned into resilience. Because that was the point. The paint on the glass wasn't just a correction. It was a stance. A quiet uprising. A message to the cowards who'd tried to shut the door that it would now never close. And in that act, done in anonymity, born of pain, painted in peace, Shaq had spoken louder than any press tour ever could. The morning of the opening arrived, with the kind of stillness that often precedes something irreversible. The sky over Newark was pale blue, unusually quiet. The city's noise hadn't yet reached its midday hum, and the block where Second Sun stood felt untouched, almost waiting. Shaquille O'Neal was already inside by sunrise, checking the last of the details. The coffee machine worked. The appointment book, real, but sparsely filled, was in place. The chairs gleamed under fresh light. The mural with its deep colors and stories etched into paint was intact. He didn't stay long. He wouldn't be there when it opened. Shaq locked the door behind him and walked away with no one noticing. It wasn't his day to be seen. It was Lennox's. Across town, Lennox O'Neal stood at a bus stop, holding a printed flyer that someone from a non-profit had handed him 2 days ago. Experienced barbers wanted, new shop on East Hudson, walk-in interviews. There was no business name, no owner listed, just a time, 10. Lennox had looked at it a dozen times before deciding to go. He had no illusions. Interviews like this rarely led anywhere, especially not for someone with a past like his. But something about the flyer had stayed with him. The wording, the location, the simplicity of it. So he went. When he arrived, there was already a small crowd gathered. Not barbers, neighbors, families, a camera crew from a local station. But no grand opening signs, no red ribbon, just the glass windows of the newly reborn shop, reflecting the morning sun. Above the door, in metallic script, read the name, Second Sons. He stared at it, puzzled. The door was open. A young woman stood inside greeting people. She looked at Lennox, offered a clipboard. You here to apply? Lennox nodded. She motioned him in. The moment he stepped inside, he froze. The mural caught his eye first, colors and shapes that felt eerily familiar. But it wasn't until he turned toward the row of stations that his breath caught. There, hanging directly above the third chair from the left, was a mirror, its frame hand-carved, dark-stained wood. A soft gold trim along the edges. Etched into the bottom of the glass, in small script, was a sentence. It was never charity. It was family. Lennox stared. He couldn't move, couldn't breathe right. The words hit harder than any argument ever had. Any silence ever could. He looked around again. The mural of 2 boys cutting hair in a basement room. One larger, protective, the other quicker with the clippers. A shadowed man in the background, watching with a hand resting on the wall. He hadn't noticed it at first, but now it was clear. The boys were them, and the man in the shadows was Shaq. It hit him all at once. This wasn't just some barbershop. It wasn't a chance job opening. It was a gift, not wrapped in pity, not branded for PR. It was a legacy, rebuilt in silence, brick by brick for him. His knees buckled slightly. He gripped the back of the barber chair to steady himself. The shop buzzed gently with movement behind him. Neighbors greeting each other, voices rising with admiration. But Lennox stood still. A tear slipped down his cheek. Not out of weakness, but relief. He wasn't alone. Not forgotten. Not abandoned. Someone had remembered. From the back hallway, Shaq watched. Not hidden but not seeking notice. He saw Lennox reading the mirror. Saw him freeze. Saw him break. It wasn't the breakdown of a man overwhelmed. It was the kind that happens when someone finally finds what they never dared ask for. He stepped forward quietly, stopping a few feet behind his brother. Lennox didn't turn around. He didn't have to. "You did all this?" he asked, voice cracking. Shaq nodded once. Shh. Lennox inhaled sharply, still facing the mirror. "Why?" Shaq looked around the shop at the mural, at the mirror, at the people filling the space with warmth. "Because I owed you more than words. I owed you presence. I owed you a place." Lennox turned then, eyes rimmed red. "This isn't charity?" Shaq shook his head. "This is yours. To run, to own, to pass down, if you want. But why not say anything? Why let me come in blind?" Shaq's voice lowered, heavy with truth. "Because I needed you to see it as yours first. Not mine, not some rich man's project. Just a shop built from every piece we thought we lost." Lennox let out a breath, half laugh, half sob. People were starting to notice now. A few murmurs in the room. A woman nudged her husband. "Is that Shaq?" Someone whispered. But he didn't care. Let them know now. Let them see what mattered. Shaq reached into his pocket, pulled out a keyring. "I believe in second sons," he said, handing it over. "The ones who don't get the spotlight. The ones who carry the weight anyway." Lennox took the keys, stared at them, then stepped forward and hugged his brother for the first time in years. No words, no performance, just arms wrapped around regret, love, and something newly healed. Around them, the room softened. Conversations quieted. The mural stood brighter somehow, and for the first time in a long time, Lennox stood taller. He turned to the crowd. The clipboard girl handed him a list of names. Interviewees, customers, volunteers. He took a deep breath and smiled. "Welcome to Second Sons," he said. "We're open." In the days following the opening of Second Sons, the neighborhood pulsed with a new rhythm. What had begun as soft curiosity, murmurs outside the door, hesitant steps across the polished floor, quickly transformed into something undeniable. The barbershop wasn't just open, it was alive, and it was changing everything around it. Shaquille O'Neal didn't return to the shop right away. He watched from a distance, the way a gardener watches from the shade, as something he's planted begins to bloom. He didn't hover, he didn't claim it. The story belonged elsewhere now. But the world didn't let it stay quiet. 3 days after the opening, an anonymous video began circulating online. Grainy, late-night footage captured from a nearby window. It showed a hooded figure, large, unmistakable in frame, standing before the vandalized window of the shop. The racial slur was visible. Then, slowly, the figure began painting over it. No sound, no spotlight, just steady hands and soft conviction. The clip hit Twitter first, then TikTok. Users speculated in comment threads, comparing silhouettes, arguing over timestamps. Within 24 hours, someone posted a second clip from a different angle, this time clearer, showing a brief profile. It was Shaq. The internet did what it does best. It swarmed. News outlets picked it up. Shaquille O'Neal silently confronts racism at community barbershop. Cable panels dissected the footage. Sports blogs pivoted from stats to symbolism. But Shaq didn't respond. Not a single statement. No repost. No denial. And that silence only made the message louder. The story shifted away from celebrity and toward community. Interviews began pouring in, not with Shaq but with the people inside the shop. Lennox, hesitant at first, eventually stepped forward. He didn't talk about Shaq's involvement. He talked about the mission, the team, the people. One of those people was Calvin, a 27-year-old who had spent 5 years incarcerated for a nonviolent drug offense. He now managed the back-end scheduling system and mentored teens on Saturdays. Then there was Marissa, a single mother and licensed barber, who hadn't found work in years due to a felony conviction in her 20s. At Second Sons, she'd not only found a chair but a platform. And the most striking was Damon, a Gulf War veteran battling PTSD, who now ran the front desk, and organized free haircut events for unhoused locals twice a month. When asked what the job meant to him, he said, "It gave me a mirror again. Not the one that shows your face, the one that shows your worth." Each story added layers to the myth of Second Sons. Not as a charity, but a challenge to everything broken. Systems that discarded people. Cities that forgot blocks. Names that went silent when trouble came. Soon people started showing up from other cities. Young barbers from Philly and Baltimore. Non-profit workers from Atlanta. Veterans from Chicago. They didn't come to marvel. They came to ask, how do we build this where we live? And still, Shaq stayed quiet. He watched the flame grow from a spark, not just online, but in real time. Community boards in Newark started pushing for similar hybrid business models. A local councilwoman proposed legislation to fund businesses offering second chances to ex-cons. A small bank reached out, asking how they could offer microloans through Second Sons. The idea had become oxygen. But with the growth came the media. They camped outside his estate. Reporters cornered him in airport terminals asking about the video. Paparazzi caught him leaving a community center and shouted questions about the shop. He didn't flinch, didn't entertain it. Shaq had made his point, and it wasn't for a soundbite. He understood something most people didn't. Some things break if you name them too soon. Second Sons wasn't a brand. It was a bridge. Built quietly, walked by many. The only time he truly spoke, was when a student journalist from a local college asked to interview him for a school project. Shaq agreed. No cameras, just a recorder. They sat on a park bench near the lake behind his home. The student, nervous, asked the question everyone else had been chasing for weeks. Why didn't you just announce it was yours from the start? Shaq looked out at the water, then said, because it was never about me. The moment it becomes mine, it stops being ours. The audio clip, posted to the college blog, went viral.
The phrase "it stops being ours" became a hashtag, then a mural, then a movement.
Other shops started appearing. Not franchises, not clones, but siblings. In Detroit, a bakery opened with the same mission. Second chances, local roots. In Houston, a mechanic shop followed suit. Each one citing Second Sons as the inspiration. Each one refusing to be branded. Just inspired. Just built. And behind them all, Shaq kept moving. Not building more shops. Not scaling the model. But watching, guiding, advising, when asked. He never put his name on a single sign, but his fingerprints were everywhere, in the silence that started the wave, in the dignity of those given space to breathe. By the time Second Sons reached its 6-month mark, it had expanded its services. Legal advisors now came in weekly. A mental health counselor volunteered twice a month. Local schools sent students for mentorship hours. The back room, once a storage space, was now a rotating resource center, stocked with donated laptops, books, and applications for job programs. Lennox stood at the helm, steady, proud, changed. In one interview he said, "This ain't about cutting hair. This is about cutting through walls, the kind you don't see but feel every day." The shop never advertised. It didn't need to. It became a symbol, not of fame, not of wealth, but of what happens when whispers are given space to grow. They become thunder. It was a cool spring morning, months after the grand opening of Second Sons, when the world finally saw Shaquille O'Neal, not as the towering legend of basketball, but as something quieter, deeper. The documentary, The Man Behind the Silence, premiered online first, an independent film crafted not by a major studio, but by the same college student who had asked him the now famous question in the park, "Why didn't you just say something?" The film opened without a title card. Just footage, black and white, silent, of Shaq sitting on a stoop outside a quiet building, a cap pulled low over his eyes, watching kids shoot hoops in a cracked neighborhood court. Then came voices, not his but those of barbers, volunteers, shop patrons, and community members, whose lives had been quietly reshaped by the movement born from that rusted garage. The narrative wasn't linear. It was reflective. Fragments of Shaq's journey pieced together not from interviews, but from moments. A shot of him painting over the slur. A worker talking about the job that changed his life. Lennox seated in the shop speaking softly about second chances and first brothers. The final segment, just 5 minutes long, was different. It returned to the place it all began. Shaq's home. His breakfast table. The same one where months ago, Lucille had asked the question that cracked open everything. Have you talked to your brother lately? Now it was Mara who asked a different question. She sat across from him, spoon in her cereal bowl, sunlight warming the kitchen through large, spotless windows. The hum of morning surrounded them, familiar and soft. Lucille folded laundry in the next room. Shawnee tapped on her tablet at the island counter. Mira looked up from her phone, watching the screen of the documentary as it played back on the television. You never told us, she said. About the shop, about the video, the painting, none of it. Shaq didn't respond immediately. He sipped his coffee, leaned back in his chair, and watched his daughter carefully. No dodge, no performance, just presence. She continued, her voice equal parts admiration and curiosity. Why didn't you just say something? He set his cup down, looked at her, and smiled. Not the public smile, not the polished one used for brand deals or charity events. This was the kind that only family saw. Some things, he said, are louder when you don't. She didn't press. She didn't have to. The truth was sitting between them, clear and full. Across the country, as the documentary reached screens and social feeds, something rare happened. People didn't just talk, they acted, quietly. One viewer left a pair of clippers and a note outside a struggling barber's door. Another paid a month's rent for a neighbor in silence. An anonymous donor cleared the debt of a local food pantry, not with credit cards or tweets, but with present. The idea that had begun in Shaq's heart, birthed from Lennox's pain, had multiplied. It had grown not through fame, but through the decision to step aside and let others step forward. And Lennox? He had changed too. Second Sons expanded, not with branches, but with purpose. The shop now hosted youth nights on Wednesdays, financial literacy workshops on Sundays, and a grief circle for Black fathers every first Friday. Lennox ran it all, not as a figurehead, but as a builder. Each day he came in early, unlocked the door, ran his hands along the edge of the mirror with the etched words. It was never charity. It was family. He didn't talk much about the early days anymore. He didn't need to. What mattered was the now. But on one quiet afternoon, when business was slow and sunlight painted gold across the floor, Lennox looked up from sweeping and saw Shaq standing in the doorway. No cameras, no crowd, just a brother visiting a brother. They didn't hug, didn't need to. They just nodded at each other, like men who had walked through fire, and finally stood on the other side. You seen the documentary? Lennox asked, setting the broom aside. Shaq shrugged. Caught a few minutes, seemed all right. They made you look like some kind of monk, Lennox chuckled. Shaq smirked. Ain't mad at that. They both laughed. The kind of laugh that comes easy after everything else has been hard. You did good, Lennox said, quiet now. You didn't just build a shop. You gave me something no one ever did. What's that? A clean slate. Shaq nodded, voice low. That's what we all need. When he left that day, there were no goodbyes. Just the click of the door and the echo of something lasting. Something earned. Back at home, the documentary finished playing. Miora leaned against the armrest. Processing, Lucille came in with folded laundry, paused to watch the final scene. Shaq walking down a quiet Newark street, hands in his pockets, nodding to a boy on a bike who didn't recognize him, and didn't need to. Shawnee looked up from her tablet, met Shaq's eyes. You know, people are gonna call you a hero now. He shook his head. Let him talk. I'm not the story.
Lucille, setting down a pile of towels, smiled softly. No, baby. You just gave the story a voice.
Outside, the wind carried the hum of life, the same kind that moves unnoticed but reshapes everything in its path. And in that moment, the man who had once filled arenas with thunderous applause chose to leave behind something quieter, something stronger. Legacy not in his name, but in the silence he filled, with action. What if the next Lennox is living just one block away from you? Unheard, unseen, but still holding on. This story wasn't fiction. It was a reflection. Step into your corner of the world and build something that matters quietly, boldly, relentlessly. Because real change doesn't wait for applause. It starts when you decide silence isn't an option anymore.